Okay, we'll start. Hello, everyone. Good evening, all. Warm greetings to everyone. I am Vinodhini, a member in SUG Chennai. It's privilege to have Andita, who is Sitecore Technology MVP. She'll take us through the webinar on heads up front-end developers for Sitecore. On behalf of SUG Chennai, welcoming Andita for the webinar, extending my warm welcome to all the participants. So, over to Andita, we're excited to hear from you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Vinodini, and thank you, Nizar, as well. I know I've tried in the past to present for Suk Chennai. Somehow it's not been working out. So this is actually the first time I'm presenting with you guys. So happy to get this opportunity as well. So welcome to all the participants. Today I'm going to be taking you through this session where we're going to be talking about the guidelines for front-end developers for working with Sitecore sites. I'm properly audible, right, Vinodni? Everything's fine?
Yes, Anil, that's great.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
All good? All right, cool. Okay, let's get started then. So, why do we need to talk about this? So upfront, I'd like to tell you guys that I'm a core backend developer as such. I don't really have much experience with, full-on front-end development. So why am I the one talking about this? I do have a lot of experience working on multiple projects with front-end teams, varying front-end teams who had different levels of experience working with Sitecore projects. So all of this feedback is based on that experience that I have. This would be especially helpful in greenfield projects, and it would be most helpful in scenarios where the front-end team is new with working on Sitecore sites. So while Sitecore itself does not impose any restrictions on HTML, there are certain best practices which, when followed, it will make the integration of backend components with HTML much smoother. It would also enable the backend Sitecore developers to follow the best standards. And the front-end team can simply deliver the HTML and front-end assets. I'm sorry about the animal noises. I live in a village, literally. So all right. So the front end team can simply deliver the front end HTML and assets as expected with any website development, and adhere with these guidelines that I'm going to talk about here. And then it's going to be a very seamless sort of experience working with the Sitecore teams as well. We're also going to be talking about how to identify or what kind of concerns need to be identified and need to be thought about, and how we would like to address them in advance. And following these guidelines is definitely going to help in reducing the collaboration time and the amount of time spent in back and forth between the backend and the front end teams, and thus also help in reducing the overall development time. Now, a lot of these things that I might be talking about, it might seem really trivial to experienced Sitecore developers. So I'm just giving you that heads up. These are very basic things, and it is probably quite obvious and accepted as a way of doing things. But making sure and getting these things on your radar, and making sure of all these things are being followed consciously, is sure going to help in streamlining the process, even for experienced teams and developers. So the first thing that we're going to be talking about is page layouts. Now, vanilla Sitecore as such has a very component-based architecture. So the first thing that you would want to do in advance when you receive your designs, and again, designs are, as we know, it's not always available in bulk. All the designs that you want, that you have to use in your website, it's not always available in bulk. So things might just keep trickling in. So a good idea when you receive your designs is to sort of decide the page layout that it's going to be using. So that essentially means dividing your page into blocks. So in this case, the example that you're seeing here, the page has been divided into 3 big blocks: the top, the middle, and the bottom. So this is a single column page. And the stuff outlined in yellow are identified as components, and they're just plopped one below the other within a given block. So essentially, each of these blocks are transformed into placeholders in Sitecore lingo. So each of these blocks will have a placeholder where you can add a bunch of components one below the other. So another example of this here would be another page that we are seeing here. So this is a 2-column page. So you have the same outer structure as such with the top, the middle, and the bottom. And in addition to that, you're again dividing one of these blocks into 2 columns. So in this case, a 2-column right sidebar kind of distinction. And in this, you can see that we have the components again plopped one below the other. So you have 2 placeholders additionally added here, which is the left and the right sidebar. So the next image here is basically to put across a point that you can use multiple layouts to kind of structure your page depending on the design that you have, and you can use a given page layout more than once on a page. Now usually you won't really see designs like this. It's pretty convoluted, so for user experience sake, you're not going to see something like this. This is just to put across a point. So the main thing that to notice as a front-end developer here would be that for each page layout that we have kind of identified in our design, we would want a common outer markup or a common outer wrapper markup, which is going to be common no matter where or how many times this page layout is used on a page. So if we take an example of this 2-column left sidebar, so ideally I would expect a div or a bunch of divs or whatever with their classes and attributes and everything, which is common. And no matter where I try to use this 2-column left sidebar, and if I just take this markup and place it anywhere on the page, it will divide the page into 2 columns with the left sidebar for me, irrelevant of where it is and which position it is and what page it is in. So that is the most important thing, that it needs to be a common markup, because this is also going to be created as a reusable component in the Sitecore side. So this is something to keep in mind. You don't want to just build pages based on the design without keeping things like this in mind, because then it's going to be hard when it comes to backend integration. So coming back, now, while we said that we would want this identical markup for a given page layout everywhere that we are using it, sometimes the design doesn't allow for having identical things. You might need to have some exceptions, something like that built in. So like in this example that you see, the 2-column left sidebar, in case it's used in the bottom of the page, it might need some additional padding for whatever reason. Say the design mandates it. So such exceptions can definitely be handled, but you would want to kind of make sure that, excuse me, you would want to make sure that this is really necessary based on the UX discussions, and we're going to be talking about that later. But so when you have these exceptions, we can definitely account for these, but the idea for the front-end developers would be make sure that the changes or these exceptions that we are making are based on very minor HTML changes, which is probably something like toggling a class or an attribute, a single thing like that. So you don't want to have completely radically different markup for kind of accommodating for these exceptions, because that just makes the code as well not very maintainable. That's not the idea. The whole idea is that you have something really, really small, which is kind of an exception and can be handled with a toggle of a class or an attribute. From a backend perspective, ideally that would be coded using a rendering parameter. You would toggle the class or the attribute based on a rendering parameter from Sitecore. A tip here to front-end developers would be to add in comments to document any of this conditional code or configurable styles. So when you're writing your markup, it's a good idea to kind of give all the options that you have accounted for in your styling in the markup itself, so in the HTML. So when, as a backend developer, I receive that HTML, I know what all I need to account for in the form of rendering parameters, and I need to kind of code for all this conditional classes or attributes, whatever be it. So that would be something to keep in mind for the front-end developer as such. So the next point is to identify reused components. As we saw in the previous example here, so we can see these these chunks outlined in yellow, they're actually the identified components. And this is a very subjective task as such, and it definitely needs to be done in advance. And this is something that you'd probably have your business analyst or your tech leads or both together kind of doing this activity. It's definitely depends on the context of the content, so this is a very subjective work, but you do need to identify these components, and you need to identify what can be reused. Now there needs to be a balance here between managing the configurations and managing exceptions between component for component reuse and keeping things simple, because obviously identical components can be reused, there's no question about that. But then the components which are just a little different from each other, is it really worth it to create another component, or do I just call it a variant of a given component? This is also a decision that should be made beforehand, before the actual development or the front end development itself starts. So this is something that all the teams need to be aligned for, and it needs to be decided in advance itself. So ideally, like we discussed about the page layouts, only minor configurations, small things like, say you have a certain two components, they look identical and one of them has a link and the other one doesn't. So that can just be achieved by using an optional link. Then you can also have different background colors for different for the components. So the same identical components have with different background colors on different pages. So stuff like that, you don't want to create a new component, because the more the components you add, remember that the time is just adding on. It's not just about development time, it's about project management time, BA time, your front end, back end, QA, documentation, content, other training, it just builds up. So there's definitely something to be said here regarding identifying the reused components and putting in an effort to do that effectively. It's not something that should be done lightly, because you also don't want to overcomplicate and over engineer things. That also makes the development it doesn't really help with development time, because it gets really complex, it's hard to maintain code, and then it's eventually going to turn into a burden for the content author as well. So a good tip here is to document your components, and this is not talking about any elaborate documentation. It's just sort of a lookup of the document of your component name and a component screenshot. That's it, a simple lookup which is just going to list out all the component names with screenshots, a visual representation. This is something that ideally a BA can take up, a backend or even a front end developer can take up, and it would depend on, I guess, the process that your project is following and responsibilities of each team as such. So ideally, it would be a shared document that you have on one place, and you decide a central naming of your components. That's also important. In Sitecore, you have a lot of teams kind of going through passes independently of all these components, and everybody seems to obviously has their own way of naming things, because this is it's more of a personal preference. So it's good to kind of maintain common naming of components and document this right off the bat, so that everybody is following the same nomenclature and looking at the same components. And it also helps in identifying what components are reused based on the new designs that you receive. So this is something that I found really useful, because that document or the lookup that we usually have, it turns out really useful, not just for developers, but also for QA and for business analysts when they try to give content author training later. And that lookup document, it also serves as a very good base for content author user guides in case you need to supply that as well as a deliverable. All your components definitely need to be modular, and that's what we saw in the previous screenshot as well. So basically, there should be no interdependencies between each of these components which are dropped in one after another. You should not have a case where you have in the right sidebar, these components that you're seeing, you should not have a case where you have two of these components having a single a different outer wrapper, and the next two being another common outer wrapper. So you don't want to have too many nestings of placeholders. So ideally, you would just want to keep like a single placeholder in this right sidebar and plop all these independent components one after another. From a front end perspective, it's a good idea to use templating engines. So if you are using a templating engine, you are also doing the development based on blocks, as in based on components, and kind of putting the page together by assembling all these blocks. So it's a similar process to what Sitecore is going to be, or Sitecore developers are going to be following to build pages. So if we do this right from the beginning, it helps reducing in a lot of anomalies as well. One thing to keep in mind is that you might have multiple instances of the same component on a page, possibly with different content. So you might want to keep that in mind, especially when you do things like JS transformations, like instantiating your sliders and carousels, that you might have multiple instances on a given page. Now, addressing design inconsistencies. In a perfect world, we would not have any design inconsistencies, but this does not happen. So this is primarily a responsibility of the front-end team. Now, truth be told, 10, 20 pixel here and there, back-end developers, we don't even notice and we just ignore it. I mean, really, it doesn't hit our radar at all. But that's where the focus of the front-end team is, and that is something that the front-end team can actually identify. So this is definitely, I think, a prime responsibility of the front-end team lead or the team members as well. So when you receive this, ideally list of reused components and stuff, so something you need to keep in mind that is that you're receiving a set of designs where these pages are kind of built up and the components are nicely placed one after another in a given sequence with a given combination. But nothing is set in stone in this case. When things go to UAT, eventually you have content authors saying, oh, okay, let's mix this up. Let's move this up and move that down. And that component in the other page which was there, I like that. Let me add that in this page. So things like that is bound to happen, and you need to account for stuff like that because that's how the Sitecore components ideally are built. Your components can have constraints as to which placeholder they can be placed in, but apart from that, the components can appear on any page, in any location, or in any position within a placeholder. So you need to account for that. And if you see that there are inconsistencies within your design which is going to act as a hindrance for this kind of reuse, then that is when you need to raise it. So either in this case you regroup with your UX or you look into building variants, how we mentioned with page layouts. So sometimes, again, if you have inconsistent spacing, say on this side it is so much pixel, or above and bottom there's a difference in the kind of spacing. Sometimes we've taken it back to the UX team and then like it's different, and then hey, okay, fine, just make it equal. So sometimes it's not really worth going in and trying to account for certain really small differences which might not have been that intentional and doesn't probably matter as much even to the UX team. So it's definitely a good idea to go back and push back with the UX team and see how much we can simplify things for ourselves as opposed to kind of adding on to variants and things like that. And obviously, if it's not an option, then definitely the next option is to go for variants. And I would request that front end teams in this case again document the variants so that right off the bat the back end team knows what kind of variants they need to account for while building the components. Page specific markup is a complete no-no. So you definitely should not have any page specific markup. But the good news here is that if you've followed all the previous stuff that we spoke about, that we've identified reuse right off the bat, and we've created modular components and addressed the design inconsistencies effectively, then this is not going to come up at all. An example here of where I've seen this happen is say in one of the projects, I believe in the search results page. For some reason, everything in the design which was there previously, it was just a little off in the search results page. So I know it's really tempting as a front end developer to add a search results class on the body tag and then account for all of these inconsistencies and style them accordingly. And even as a back end dev, I think um, a lot of us have probably done it in the past. I'm sure no one can deny that that we just added a if condition based on the item ID or template ID or something like that and just add a class. Or even worse, we have kind of added classes in a class field in Sitecore, which is like the worst thing that we can do, because the whole point is to separate the content from your design. But anyway, so this is definitely something that as a front end and back end team we should completely avoid. And as a stopgap, what we want to do is account for these kind of inconsistencies. either on a page layout level or on component levels itself. So it's a better idea to add this kind of exception logic on 4 or 5 components on the page rather than try and figure out how to add something on a body tag for just one page. So that's about this. So we're going to be talking about some of the common fields in Sitecore or any CMS for that matter, and what you need to keep in mind for these. So that's what the next chunk of the slide is about. So regarding links or link fields in Sitecore, out of the box, they are generated as anchor tags. So for redirect links, that's what you want to use, anchor tags, as opposed to using buttons, which might be a good idea for using for elements that act as switches, which you're probably going to rig up from JavaScript or jQuery. Try to avoid unnecessary inner HTML. So any styling that you need to do for just text within your links, it's a good idea to do that based on classes on the anchor tag itself, instead of trying to add like span tags and things like that and styling those. Obviously, if you need inner HTML, you can add it. But just for styling text, it's a good idea not to do that because it keeps the backend markup as well simple, and also helps in experience editor mode, which we'll talk about in a bit. Regarding images, so images are by default rendered in img tags, so try to favor those over background images. You can definitely use background images, but that's something additional that needs to be done for inline editing or experience editor. um, Image urls must be in the markup. Obviously, if you want them to be content managed, they need to be a part of the markup. A good example here is in almost all the designs nowadays, we see social icons in the header and the footer, or just in the footer. So it's quite. I've seen a tendency of front end teams to usually use sprites or something like that, and manage the icons from CSS. And on the other hand, the business requirement might be that the content author should be able to add new links if they'd like to, or change the icons, or have control over the icons. So in this case, we end up having a little bit of back and forth where we go back to the front end team and tell them, no, no, put it as images and put it in the front end because I need to get this from Sitecore. So what I would say is for stuff like this, if you're putting any of the icons and things into sprites, or you're getting setting any of these in CSS, it's a good idea to check and make sure that these all of these icons or whatever that you're setting from the CSS are not required to be content manageable. Rather than going over multiple iterations again and spending time in changing things that you've already built. Moving on to rich text fields. So as we know, these are some. This is Telerik rich text field as such, which is used within Sitecore, and it gives the ability to the content author to manage formatted content. So this can be a boon and a curse because it does give the flexibility to add formatted content. But on the flip side, if your content author is adventurous and is CSS aware, then they have a tendency to write a lot of full-on CSS, wanting to make things look the way they would like to, and it also gives them the ability to break the design if they wanted to. So as a front-end developer, a good idea here is to make sure that any chunk of content or formatted content which is coming in, which is going to be coming out of a rich text field in Sitecore. So a good example of this is your page content, or your page body. So every page ideally has a sort of a page body in it. So there, the content author might want to add lists and or tables and anything, images or links and stuff like that. And you obviously need to style all this based on your design so that it kind of adheres with the general design. So a good rule of thumb as a front-end developer is to make sure that anything coming out of rich text is as simple bare-bone HTML as possible. You don't want to make it complicated because this is something which is in control of the content author. So you don't want to add a bunch of inline classes in there because then the content author will have to remember this stuff. And if they remove all of this stuff, it's just going to break your page. So ideally, what you would do is have a common, a wrapper tag or class, a custom class, and make sure that the backend team is aware that they need to always wrap any rich text output within this given wrapper tag or class. So anywhere a rich text field is being output, the wrapper is the class is available, and that's what you would ideally style all the rich text on. Now, this being said, it's not always possible to keep custom classes out of the way for rich text because sometimes you have really complex formatted content. We do have ways of gracefully working around this as backend developers, and if you're aware of this, then this is something you can request as well. So the basic things that we have available is custom classes and HTML snippets, and this is something that can be configured without a single line of code from as a backend developer. So if you look at the Sitecore rich text field, you have a provision on the left here where you're seeing the content author, backend developers can actually configure and add any custom classes here. So the content author can just add these classes and it'll get appended to the current tag that they have on their content. And the other option, which is on the right, is how you configure snippets, the HTML snippets itself. So an entire block of HTML snippet with whatever tags and classes and attributes that you need. So all of that can be configured as one chunk as an option. So the content author can simply go and click on the snippet, and the entire chunk is going to be output into the editor, and they can edit the text that they want inside it. So these are two things which are very simple and can be configured very easily by a backend developer. So it's something to keep in mind. So this is something that we can handle gracefully. So this, along with the outer class as such for styling, ideally we should be able to handle things with these. It will make a lot of the content author training time also to come down. In addition to this, beware of the p tag. So this is just something to be aware of as front-end developers, that while inline editing is possible in the rich text editor, so as content authors hit enter and stuff like that, so the editor automatically adds p tags to denote paragraphs, and enters as you hit enter, it kind of creates new paragraphs. So it's just something to be aware of as you do the styling, and also to know, because you don't want to wrap entire rich text being output within a p tag, because you want to avoid nesting in this case. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is experience editor. So this is a mode in Sitecore, as all of us are aware, most of us are aware, I'm hoping, that where we can inline edit pages. Edit the content of the pages in an inline mode. So this is something, it's a mode that Sitecore provides, and a lot of additional markup and CSS and JS is added on the page to support this kind of inline editing. So I've kind of shown an example in there. You can edit your texts and links and stuff like that. And there's a lot of things that we can do as backend developers as well to provide maximum editing support in this mode, which is a whole different story altogether. But as a front-end developer, you'd want to avoid using position-based selectors in CSS and JS, because all of that is not going to work in this case with the additional generated markup. And if you're using jQuery in your project, it's highly recommended that you use no conflict to avoid framework clashes, and use closures and wrap your code in self-invoking functions. One thing that I would like to kind of talk about over here is something that I've seen a lot of experienced front-end teams kind of doing. So when you have constructs like your sliders and carousels and stuff like that, it sometimes makes it quite difficult to edit the content of these sliders or each slide within the slider inline in Experience Editor mode. So in that case, I've seen a lot of these teams kind of splitting out the functionality of editing and previewing. So Sitecore as such has their own preview mode as well, where content authors can go and preview the pages without publishing them with what is saved, um, uh, without all the additional generated markup and CSS, which the experience editor does. So this is something that I've seen. It's usually just ignored, the preview mode. In all my years, I've seen a very few people actually use the preview mode, but I've seen projects where they're pushing it, and it seems like a really good idea, because we spend a lot of our time, energy, and effort in trying to make everything editable in Experience Editor, and sometimes these constructs like sliders and carousels, it just makes it very difficult, and it's not worth the kind of effort that we put in. So what they usually end up doing is, in this case, is that you ask the backend developer to output a class, say on your body tag, to denote when a page is loaded in Experience Editor mode. And as a front-end developer, you would initialize these um, constructs only when the page is not being loaded in Experience Editor mode. So what would happen in that case is, when I load the page in Experience Editor mode, the slider would actually appear as slides one below the other. It would not be initialized as a slider. It would just appear one below the other, which would make it really easy for me to enter content as a content editor, because I don't have to worry about the interactions getting mumbled for whatever reason. So it's easy for me to edit all the content there. And if I want to see what it looks like, I would go into the preview mode and look at it. Now, this is a little bit of a controversial, I guess, suggestion here, because the whole point is, um, being a WYSIWYG editor, which is kind of being ignored in this case. But it's one way to go, and this is something you should definitely evaluate if you have a very JavaScript and transition heavy website. Next thing we're going to talk about is API integration and jQuery AJAX calls. So depending on the kind of components you have, you always have come across designs with listings and search, which has pagination and filters and faceting and stuff like that. So these kind of dynamic components which need some sort of front-end interaction for fetching data. So these are the kind of things where you would need to think about API integration and AJAX calls. So there would be two ways of doing this, depending on the kind of data and the kind of component that you have. Either you have all the data that you need for these front-end interactions as a part of your markup somewhere, say a JSON added in a data attribute of a tag. So all the JSON is already on the page, on page load. Upside would be that front-end interactions would be super quick, but obviously you would not want to do this when there is too much data on your or there is a possibility of having too much data, because you don't want to fetch all of this and reduce your performance of initial page load. So it depends again on your business logic and on the kind of data that you have. So first way would be to have the data in the markup, and the second way obviously is to always hit the server and just get back the amount of data that you need using an API. Whatever the case it is, usually it's a good idea that while doing the front end development itself, you can create the JSON structure and kind of fix the JSON structure of the data that you need. And if you're using the data in the markup method, then you just put that JSON in the sample JSON in the markup, and you finish coding all of the front end interactions that you have. So this is actually one of the main things where I've seen a lot of delays can crop up if this is not handled upfront. So if this is handled initially and handled completely by the front end team, then this is somewhere we can really save a lot of time. So ideally, you would fix the JSON structure and put the JSON in the markup if that's what is decided, or you create a mock API if you're going to go the API route. And you have a lot of tools out there. One such is API, where you can it helps in mock API hosting. So you basically have an API and API URL, a mock API URL, and it returns the whatever sample JSON that you have provided over there as well. What you would do is probably add this API URL in your markup itself. So as a backend developer, when I receive this HTML, I would either see the JSON directly in the page, or I would see the markup, your mock API, and based on that, um, I would build the real API, which returns the JSON data in the same structure and format. And once I build the API, I would just replace the URL, the mock API URL, and ideally it would all work as a nice plug and play mode. So if this is followed effectively, this is something that I've seen, teams with a lot of experience, they do this really beautifully, and there's also a lot of scope to screw up royally in this case. So this is something that I think definitely should be paid attention to, because it has a lot of potential of saving time. So last thing I'm going to be talking about is Sitecore Forms. So as we are aware, Sitecore Forms is basically a plugin within Sitecore where it helps the content author in building forms on the fly without the need of any development, and uh, dropping it on pages and using it anywhere. So they can build any new forms and um, use it on pages on the fly. Now, the decision of using Sitecore Forms is something that needs to be, it's probably going to be done beforehand by the business analyst and the Sitecore lead before things come for front end development. So when you get to any page with forms, it's a good idea to always confirm whether Sitecore Forms is going to be used or not. The biggest constraint here is because this is something that is controlled by Sitecore. The markup is already generated. The markup is generated from Sitecore of the form. So it's not like you don't have complete control over the markup of the form. While you can style things, you have to work around the markup which is already there for you, and that's not something you can build from scratch. So that is what you have to understand here. The decision of using Sitecore forms or not is usually based on the kind of designs that you have. Because again, you can style things to a certain extent, but if your design is really, really nuts, it's difficult to manage. It's harder to try and make something fit into a box which doesn't fit. So you can just build things on your own. So that's usually the process that goes into figuring out if Sitecore forms is going to be used or not. So ideally, that's done way before the development actually starts. So the way to ideally go around this would be, if you are using Sitecore forms, I would say that request the backend team to get a test form out there for you with a whole bunch of fields dropped into it. And what you should ideally do is, you would look at the test form and kind of try to style it based on the design prerequisites that you have. So that would usually be a better way of doing things. There's really no point in trying to build out a custom form and handing it off to the backend team, because they can't do anything about it. It's quite hard to, make things look exactly how you would like it to look based off of custom HTML and Sitecore forms. The last thing you'd also want to note is that Sitecore Forms also has a provision for setting validations and stuff. So obviously, you'd like to you would want to style those validation messages, etc., which are being generated, as opposed to creating custom validations as required in the form. So I think, yeah, that's all I had. If you have any questions or any comments that you guys would like to add based on your experience for this topic, the floor is open.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey, I have a question. Actually, while using the Sitecore forms, so we faced one issue like forms. So somewhere we missed the closing.
Your voice is breaking up,
The
Vinodini.
page was rendering differently.
Hello?
Is it audible? Hello, are you able to hear me now? Hello.
Yeah, your voice was breaking up in between. Could you repeat, please?
Okay, let me post it in the chat, Anita.
Meanwhile, any other questions? Right, so I haven't received your question yet.
Hello.
Yeah,
Is
hi.
it clear now?
I haven't received any question. I'm looking at the conversation. There's nothing here.
Yes, I am typing it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, tell me, what were you saying? Let's try that again.
Okay. So unfortunately we have missed one closing tag. So the
Okay.
page was rendering inappropriately. Is there any?
Mhm.
So when we looked it, we checked all the components and all. It was taking. So we spent lot of time. So we came to know that it was missing one div closing tag. After that, it is in Sitecore forms. So is there any
Okay.
possibility to identify it? The HTML markup uh, is something got jumbled. Is there any way for it?
So I believe there we do have I think extensions, Chrome extensions itself, where you can do HTML validations and stuff like that, right? So that might be a good idea to run through as well, because if there are missing tags and stuff, so this is not definitely Sitecore specific. It's just generally available tool for any site. So that could be probably something that you could use in this case if you're not sure of where things are breaking with regard to your markup,
Okay.
right?
Okay, Indra. Thank you.
Cool. So any other questions? All right.
Okay.
So I
Okay.
mean,
I
my
hope.
contact information is up on the screen anyhow. So if there's anything else or any points you'd like to add, just feel free to reach out to me. And
Sure.
yeah, I was looking to kind of use this as a reference, especially I think this works as a good reference for uh, teams who are new. They're usually, in one of my recent projects, this is what happened, because we hired a new front end team and they asked us, is there anything we need to take care of while we do the HTML? And we were like, no, no, just make it modular. And then we just left it at that. And then the whole can of worms opened, and for months we were dealing with stuff like this. So that's why this component kind of came up, this whole
Okay.
idea of building this. So if there's anything else, then please let me know. We're also kind of having a white paper that we are documenting and keeping for potential clients and potential new front end teams. So I'll definitely keep trying to work on that and keep that updated and add some SXA specific information as well, because everything we spoke about is vanilla Sitecore here. So anything to be added, anything you want to collaborate with me on this about, please do reach out to me. And thank you so much
Sure,
for hosting me.
Indra. Okay. Pretty much, I think you covered all those things should be taken care of. So thank you for the amazing presentation, and it would be very useful. So when we starting from the scratch, right, it will be very useful. Thank you for such a interesting presentation. So
Awesome.
extending
Thanks.
my thanks to all the participants. Thank you all.
Thank you then. Have a nice weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.